Hello and welcome. You are listening to Moodally Matters, the podcast that recognizes that your mood matters. Every episode, we talk to a range of amazing guests with experience in some of the top organizations in the world, discussing work life at the crossroads of mood, well-being, and performance. Together, we aim to create better workplaces, one mood at a time. Let's get started with your host, Moodally founder, Erica First.
Hello and welcome. I am Erica First, the host of Moodally Matters. On today's episode, we're talking about trust. According to my guest today, Reloveution founder Marissa Badgley, trust is not only a developable skill, but also at the core of most workplace issues. In this amazing interview, Marissa shares her 8 core components of trust, how to build them, and what to do when trust breaks down. Now, on to the episode. Thank you, Marissa, for being here with me today.
It is an absolute pleasure. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. Why don't you give us all a little bit of an introduction as to who you are?
Yeah, so my name is Marissa Badgley, and I am the founder of Reloveution. So that's love in the center of the revolution. And we are working to disrupt harmful cycles in workplaces and leadership to create organizations where human beings can truly thrive as their most authentic and amazing selves. My background is in nonprofit capacity building originally, and spent a lot of time working in nonprofits, being a leader within nonprofits, and being a victim to some of the harmful culture things that happen within nonprofit organizations. And when I left my job several years ago, I realized that many of those elements were not specific to nonprofit ecosystems, and that there's widespread lack of trust, lack of effective and prepared leaders, harmful cultures just across the board. And I am on a mission to prevent what happened to me from happening to other people. And I'm happy to tell you more about that, but that's the Cliff Notes version of who I am and what I do.
Okay, so it's actually really interesting that you mentioned that, because I know my image, and this may be from ignorance of not having had to deal with it, is that when you talk about nonprofits, they're sort of organizations of people who want to do good coming together. And so you would think that they would be less toxic, because my whole career has been in for-profit organizations. And I can assure you that everyone is like an experiment in sociology. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear that you have that there too.
Yeah. So it's definitely cross-sector, cross-industry, cross-workplace. All workplaces are studies in psychology and human behavior, and humans are messy wherever we are. My experience within the nonprofit sector, and I know this experience is shared by a lot of my nonprofit peers, is that I loved my job. I felt like I was doing work that I was meant to do. I was making a difference in the world. I enjoyed every second of it. And the trade-off to that was that I was working 50 to 70 hours a week. And because I cared so much about this mission and making the world a better place, and our environment was not set up in a way that allowed for setting boundaries within that. There's a lot of martyrdom culture within nonprofits where it's like, if you cared about our mission, you'd be willing to do whatever it takes to be able to do the work. And I find that, so now I work with about 50% of my clients are not in nonprofits, and then all the other industries fall in the other 50%. And I talk a lot in my work around work culture, around the need to balance compassion and accountability. And what I find is that within corporate spaces, there's a lot of accountability and very limited amount of compassion that's comfortable. And in nonprofit spaces, there's an abundant amount of compassion and very little accountability, or struggles with accountability. And that can look a lot of different ways. And I'm absolutely generalizing. But we need to find balance in both spaces and in all spaces. And they're definitely different cultures and different dynamics, but the human dynamics are equally messy wherever we are.
Right. Well, I guess that's good to know that,
Good to know, terrible to know, I don't know.
Exactly. Good to know, bad to know. Certainly opportunity for improvement across the board.
Absolutely.
And so you kind of tapped into this, but can you go into depth a little bit on the personal and professional mission that you're carrying out now?
Yeah. So I mentioned that I am on a mission to prevent what happened to me from happening to other people. And so I can extrapolate a little bit more on that. So in my environment, again, I loved my job. I was passionate about what I was doing, really enjoyed working with my colleagues, had a good boss. And yet I was in this system that was harming me in a lot of different ways. And part of that had to do with systems in place or lack of systems in place. Part of it had to do with bias and discrimination, not only towards me, but towards others. Part of it had to do with the sheer number of hours we were working within communities and with people who were experiencing high levels of trauma, which added a component of vicarious trauma to my experience in workplaces. And part of it was the fact that I thought that there was something wrong with me. So on top of this really high stress, high impact job, I was working with a coach. I was working with a therapist. I was doing all of the self-care stuff to try to fix myself. And none of that worked because the system itself wasn't working. Mm-hmm. And I realized at some point that I could put in all of the work in the world, and that system and that culture wasn't going to shift to be able to truly support me. And I talk about my experience with burnout quite regularly. My personal experience with burnout landed me in the hospital 3 times in less than a year. I know that is not an uncommon story, but the physiological response to chronic stress and burnout was real for me. I was convinced I was dying of a heart attack multiple times. The doctor said, "You're just really stressed out." And ultimately, I determined that the best thing for me was to leave my role without a plan at that point. And I had no idea what I was going to do. I was too burnt out and exhausted to know even who I was in that moment. And so I left without a plan. I continued working with my therapist. I continued working with my coach, really focused on healing myself, doing things that I love, rediscovering who I wanted to be in the world. And realized that the mission was to do this prevention work and to help organizations not only tell their people to take better care of themselves, which is very prevalent, like here's coaching, here massage vouchers, here like all of the things that we do towards that self-care, and really thinking about how to create workplaces that are truly sustainable for people in terms of their culture, in terms of their systems, in terms of their policy, in terms of their leadership, in terms of their management. And I really believe strongly in taking a holistic approach to professional wellness in workplaces, because so often, like, we had consultants come in to focus on one of those areas. We're going to talk about management, but if you're not also talking about culture, it doesn't work. We had consultants come in and say, we're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but without looking at systems, we weren't going to see long-term change. And so I really pay a lot of attention to, like, one of the pieces of this mission for me is antibiotics, not Band-Aids or painkillers. How do we wipe out the diseases, and how do we do that on a really holistic level? And I'm really enjoying it. And I'm doing it on my own terms, which is even more magical.
Amazing. Well, congratulations on that. It sounds there's a lot of parallels between our experience. So it's nice to see a fellow person trying to fight the good fight. And the skill you're going to be sharing with us is the concept of trust within the workplace. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can tell you lots about it, and it's not all going to fit into this period of time. So trust is something that I find absolutely fascinating, and I've done a lot of research related to trust over the last several years. I use a lot of other people's research. I've created a bunch of my own. We actually have a trust diagnostic tool that we use with organizations to help identify where trust is breaking down, not only with individuals, but also on that organizational level that I was talking about. So I'll tell you all about all of those things. But I think that it's important to start with the fact that about just talking a little bit about what trust is. And for me, and in my practice, trust is the foundation. It's the aorta of the heart of organizations. It's what allows us to feel psychologically safe. It is the basis of strong human relationships. And we know that those things are important in all elements or all places in our lives, not just in workplaces, although my focus is on workplaces. Trust is internal, it's emotional, it's cognitive, it's also affective. And it's really challenging because it's one of those things that is instant and subconscious, and that can be really dangerous, and it can also be really uncomfortable. So when we feel trust, we feel a sense of confidence, whether that's confidence in a person, in a group, in an organization. And that's great. And our brains are wired to tell us whether we trust somebody within the first 10 seconds that we meet them. And that's how a lot of bias can creep in there. We're more likely initially to trust people who are like us, right, who are a part of the same groups or are from where we're from. And so when we interact with a person, we have these preconceived notions that tell us a little about trust, but the real work begins in recognizing whether we trust somebody from the get-go and then course correcting in real time, which is really challenging. There's a lot of stuff out there, and right, parents say it to their kids, you have to earn my trust. Bosses say it too. And trust does need to be earned. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more, or I hope to be able to tell you a little bit more about the components of trust and how we earn trust. It does need to be earned, but it needs to be two-sided. It needs to be bidirectional, right? A relationship with a boss and their direct report or two colleagues isn't going to work if trust only goes in one direction. And we often are only paying attention to our part or the other person's part. And I really believe that this is a collaborative experience of building trust. And in organizations, that trust building needs to happen with individuals. Individuals need to be trustworthy and be trusted. It needs to happen with teams, and it needs to happen with organizations. The systems and policies and procedures of organizations can be trustworthy or untrustworthy. And that's something that just is very often ignored in the research. So I think those are sort of my initial thoughts about how trust shows up. And I'd love to share more.
Yeah. So I think let's start maybe with the components of trust, because I think I'd like to see what's universal, because I think that there can also be, as you mentioned, there's differences between different groups. It's like what I need to feel trust may be different than what another person needs to feel trust, or I consider you showing up on time something that helps me build trust, whereas another person, that's not important. So are there universal factors that go across groups, social factors, et cetera?
I think so. There some people say that trust is an emotion rather than a skill. I believe very strongly that it is a skill. I also believe that while there are subjective components to trust and trustworthiness, the objective is really important to me. And it actually came out of a conversation about 5 years ago. I was talking to somebody and they're like, well, trust is subjective. I don't pay attention to trust. And that really irked me, because it was like, oh, well, we know that trust is such an essential ingredient to leadership, to success, to performance. And there have to be objective components. So I found this really cool school of research called the trust quotient that is fairly popular. People know what that is. Many people know what that is. And it's brilliant research. And so they talk about these 4 characteristics that every trustworthy person has. For me, it didn't go far enough. And so over the last several years, I've been building out what I consider to be the 8 objective components of trust. The first 4 that I will share are from that original trust quotient research. And then I'll let you know the ones that I have added on and coach people on in my work. So again, there are 8 variables here. 8 is a lot to pay attention to. And the first thing I tell people is that we should only pay attention to 1 or 2 at a time. Our brains can't handle 8 things at once. And so as I'm going through this list, if our listeners want to think about, oh yeah, that's something I struggle with, or yeah, that's why I don't trust my boss, really only try to think about one or 2 things at a time. So the first variable here is reliability. So reliability means that we do what we say we're going to do, when and how we say we are going to do it. It also means that people count on us and can count on us to be consistent. They have confidence in our ability to show up. I'm going to phrase all of these in terms of individuals, but they're all equally applicable to organizations. Organizations also have to be reliable. Organizational systems need to be reliable. The second variable is credibility. So having the skills and knowledge we need to do our work well, and actually know what we're talking about. So in organizations, so often there are managers and people who are promoted who have no idea how to manage, who have no idea what they're doing. And I've questioned many times, how did this person get in their role? And so when people are promoted into roles and they're not credible in their roles, that is a depreciator of trust almost every time.
Which, if I can put like a little parenthesis in there, because
Sure.
I've had this experience too, also as a manager and as an employee. I had never once in my entire life received management training in any of the jobs I was in. I had to go and seek it out on my own, read books on my own. And I think that this is one of the absolute biggest issues to tackle in every single organization, because so much of productivity and well-being and what we do in the office depends on our manager, who more often than not has had absolutely no training in learning how to do that, which is a skill. So I will be quiet now and let you get on to number 3.
No. So I'm going to keep the parentheses open for just a second. So Reloveution has 5 signature programs and offerings, and one of them is a management accelerator program for exactly the reason that you just described. People don't know how to do it, which means that when they are uncredible, it's not their fault.
Right.
And that's really hard to solve for in organizations. Because, I mean, it's easy for the organization to say, we're going to put everyone through management training, which you should do. If you're not doing that, please do it. But for the person who might be being perceived as untrustworthy as a result of their credibility, it might not be on them. And that sucks.
Right. Okay. So sorry, number 3.
All right. Number 3 is, so the original research refers to intimacy, which I have a lot of discomfort using that word in terms of workplaces. So I define it as relationships. And for me, relationships is all about knowing people for who they are and not just for what they do. And allowing people to know you beyond just your role, right? One of the things that happens, it's like, you should just trust me because of my role, or you should just respect me because of my title. And that doesn't work. Right. Relationships are really, really important. And then the 4th piece, and they lay claim to this being the most important piece, it's the denominator in the trust quotient, is lack of ego and low self-orientation, which means that we act in the interest of others rather than our own self-interest. And full transparency, this is a place where I know that early in my career, I lacked some trust or it depreciated my trust a bit because I really wanted to grow in my career. I was super competitive. I wasn't going out and cutthroat and trying to destroy people's careers, but I was really looking out for myself and for the people that I was serving in the community. and not looking out for my colleagues so much. And that is something that depreciates culture, depreciates trust really, really quickly. So taking ego out of it is really important, showing that you care about the well-being and the wellness and the success of others above yourself is huge, especially as a manager or as a leader. I'm just going to really quickly mention these other ones. They're fairly self-explanatory. The fifth variable ingredient is integrity. So doing the right thing every time, even when there's pressure to do something else. For me, integrity also has something to do with being honest and standing up for other people when the situation warrants it. There's also a need. I talked about compassion before. Compassion is huge. Being able to be motivated to relieve the suffering of others, to be radically empathetic, to understand other people, and just practice compassion. If we're not compassionate, I don't think we can be fully trustworthy. Authenticity is a really big piece. So showing up as we truly are, not pretending to be other people, and allowing other people to do the same. And the eighth piece is fairness. So treating everybody equitably and fairly, making sure that we are recognizing and disrupting our own biases. And there's an element about fairness that is more specific to organizations that's really important, that people have the same or similar outcomes when they do the same or similar things. So people are promoted if they act in a certain way, which we know is not often equitable in organizations. It's not always fair. So that fairness piece is important. And so all of these pieces, these 8 things, again, it's a lot of things to pay attention to. They are, when you build one, you become more trustworthy. When you focus on building 1 or 2 or 3, there's always a net gain. And if you can embody all 8 of them, amazing. But if you can embody 5 or 6 of them, you're light years ahead of most people in workplaces. And it's about awareness and just recognizing this is a place where I might be able to be more trustworthy or build more trust for myself, for my team, for my organization. So that's a lot of information. And I'm going to pause because I just talked a lot.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And it's funny because I was already like stuck at your first one, reliability, because that to me, I mean, dealing with organizations or dealing with other people, it's like, it's so hard. You know, people miss calls, they miss meetings, they miss this. And, you know, part of it's not their fault. We're all still kind of suffering from post-COVID trauma, mental trauma. So how can we build some of the skills to strengthen this trust profile?
Yeah. So I want to just mention really quickly what you said before is really important, that different people value different components of this at different levels. They're all really important cross-culturally, cross-generationally, and there may be some of them that are worth 5 points to one person and 3 points to another. It always adds, but it doesn't, but sometimes it adds more or less depending on who the person is and what their background is. And that makes it really hard. So how do we do this? So there are 2 components of this question. So how do we build as individuals, right? Or maybe there are 3 components. How do we build trust as individuals who are working, living, leading, all of the things? How do we show people that we trust them? So that's really important for managers and leaders. And then how do we build trust organizationally and culturally? And they're very similar, but they're also different. So I'll start with the first one. And I'm not going to share all of it, but I'm happy to have follow-up conversations with anyone who wants to dig deeper. So, I mean, the easiest thing in terms of building trust is to pay attention to the trust variables and actually know for real where trust is breaking down. So we can suspect that reliability is a struggle for us and people aren't trusting us because of that. But unless we actually have the conversation, we don't know. So the first step is to be regularly assessing trustworthiness on your team or with your partner, and see where it's breaking down, not only from your point of view, but also from other people's point of view. And again, just focus on one or two at a time. We're not going to be 100% trustworthy at all times, and that's part of being human. One of the things that has been really powerful for me in my experience in building trust is showing vulnerability and being really open and honest about mistakes and failures and when I fall short of being perfect, which when we rise into management and leadership roles can feel really uncomfortable because for some reason we've been programmed to think that managers and leaders shouldn't make mistakes. Yeah. And that is incredibly, talking about wellness, that's incredibly emotionally taxing to feel like you have to be on and perfect and good all of the time. So being vulnerable
and also
goes a
not
really long
believable.
way. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it goes to that authenticity piece, right? Where we need to actually be honest about who we are and show up as that imperfect, perfectly flawed person. Being an ally and an advocate is really powerful when we are in workplaces and in general. So that goes to the self-orientation piece of things not only being about us, but standing up for people for whom cultures or systems or leaders, like they may not be getting served in the same ways. And that, and standing up as an ally, being a voice and listening and advocating for people goes a really long way. And I think that the last thing that I'll mention just about this building trustworthiness as an individual is that we can't be defensive. So it hurts. It is so uncomfortable when somebody says, I don't trust you, or I don't trust this decision that you made. Because trust is this thing, like, of course I'm trustworthy. What do you mean you don't trust me? And this is as true in our romantic relationships as it is in our professional relationships. We really need to be able to take a step back and listen and hear where that's coming from and be willing to adjust our practice and bend to support the boundaries and preferences and needs of others when they are not our own. And this, again, is really hard and it can be really uncomfortable, but it's also one of the biggest things we can do to be trustworthy in the eyes of our people or our partners.
Yeah, that's so interesting. The fact of being, I love the idea of being vulnerable, like going back to the point of admitting that you've been able to make a mistake. And I think I've seen that in my own experience, that it creates an enormous amount of trust in a very short amount of time, because it breaks down those facades and everything else. And also being willing to hear where maybe you're falling short, because I think none of us, as you said, none of us wants to think like, oh, I'm totally not a trustworthy person. I would never trust me,
Right.
But we may be doing things that cause that reaction.
Absolutely. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert or perfect at any of this. I'm very much still learning and growing. And one of the things that I know has been really hard for me are the pieces of trustworthiness that are really outside of my control. So one of the things I've learned is that trust is really about seed planting. So, and it takes a long time for that, for us to fully trust each other. We plant the seed, we nurture the seed, but sometimes we're planting seeds in soil with poison in it. Yeah. Or this person has had really adverse previous experiences that make them less likely to trust. So we have to try harder. We need to compensate more. Or really dialogue, to your point, about what is truly going on.
How do we know that there's trust breakdowns in the organization?
So people start turning off. People are less engaged. Research shows that when we don't have trust or when trust is breaking down, People are less productive, their performance suffers, revenue goes down, engagement goes down, creativity and innovation goes down. And then perhaps most important to the bottom line is that retention suffers. People leave when they don't trust someone or something. And if they don't leave, often they become sort of a cancer in that workplace of like, because if they're not able to move on from whatever was causing that lack of trust, when trust is breaking down, people don't feel psychologically safe, which in my opinion is a form of trauma. So, which triggers our bodies into trauma response. So you see more fight, flight, freeze when people are untrusting because they're experiencing trauma. Their brains are telling them that they are at risk. Trust is one of those things that's really primitive and evolutionary. And like we are designed to trust somebody intuitively on purpose to know whether or not we are safe in this moment or need to run away. Yeah. And so when those things start showing up, it often points to a trust thing. And what I'll say is that, so we work around work culture, employee engagement, leadership, and management development. So people come to me with those problems all the time. I would say that more than half of the time, the problem they're actually experiencing is a trust problem. And that's the foundational, when you peel back the layers of whatever a person thinks their organizational problem is, trust is very frequently the thing that it comes down to. And it's also the hardest one to solve in the long term. Right. And it doesn't happen quickly. So that can be really challenging.
Okay. So let me just wrap up here, make sure that I've gotten all your points. We have these 8 elements that compose our 8 components of trust: reliability, credibility, intimacy or relationships. I'm with you on the use of intimacy in the workplace. Not a fan. Lack of ego, integrity, compassion, authenticity, and fairness. And all of these in one way, shape, or another sort of make up a holistic trust experience. And ways we can get better at doing these is, first of all, just to pay attention to the fact that they exist. Like, look at the different ones and think about how am I, have a self-reflection, but also maybe ask someone close to you or ask someone that you work with that you do trust. How am I on these different things? Also, something interesting, ask the people in your team how important. I think that's interesting to have like a trust profile for each person, like which of these 8 things is more important to you. So you know how to build trust with each person in your team, or also as from employer to boss. To be able to show vulnerability and be honest about where your shortcomings are, especially when they happen. I think this was one thing I wanted to mention, is that if you make a mistake and do something that contributes to your untrustworthiness, but you automatically call it out and say, yes, I did this. Here's the reason why. I understand that this could damage the relationship that we have based on trust, but this is why I did it. That you could actually turn that into a trust building moment through being honest. Not to be defensive, and to understand that this is a process that takes time, and it's about building things. So also like through awareness, through constant dialogue, I would say, but picking a few of those and sort of sticking to them. Have I done a good job of summing up with what, I mean, it's a huge topic. I'm sure we could talk for 6 hours, but
absolutely. So there are a couple of things that I want to add on an organizational level, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I feel like, so all of the things you just summarized are exactly right. And they're hard. And when we're thinking about organizations and teams, trust can get a little bit wonky and it feels a little out there. So I just want to bring it down to a couple of things that organizations can do to build their organizational trustworthiness. And the first is, and this is what we start with in all of my interventions, is building a universal culture that has clear expectations and where people are held accountable. So again, being compassionate does not mean that people aren't held accountable. And people need to know what they're going to be held accountable to in order to trust the organization itself. And so we need to do that really intentionally. I had a conversation yesterday with somebody that I'm doing some coaching with somebody, and she was sharing about how internally their employee resource group, their ERG, was reading this book about bias and gender and so on and so forth. And in the same quarter where they're reading this book, that all of this information about gender pay gaps came out about the company. And so one of the things we need to do organizationally is to make sure we're not being hypocritical,
right,
and actually doing what we say we're going to do. That goes into that reliability and credibility piece. But our internal messages and our external messages have to match. And yeah, so that just feels really, really important.
No trust washing.
Right. Yeah. It's no, I like that term. No trust washing. And then one of the other organizational things, so people often come to me, leaders often come to me and think that the answer to their trust problems is transparency. And transparency is a way that we can build trust. But sometimes organizations become too transparent. And oftentimes employees think that what they want is transparency, but really they need to trust the person making the decision on the other side of that wall.
Right.
And so that just feels important to name that if we peel back the layers on transparency, it's often actually a trust problem. And oversharing, ironically, is something that depreciates trust. So it's like, why are you telling me all of these things? Why aren't you just doing your job?
Right.
Because you asked me to tell you these things, but not really. That's not really what I meant. So like that's a place where this really breaks down really quickly.
That's interesting. And I was getting sort of the image of like parents asking their young children, like, what do you think we should do with our money in the stock market? You know, it's like, figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll end on this, that I've already mentioned this trust building stuff is hard. It's uncomfortable. It doesn't always feel great when we realize that our team or our organization or ourself is not trustworthy. If trust has broken down, healing is required. It's not just about building trust in the future. It's about healing from the lack of trust in the past as well. This means we have to acknowledge feelings. It means we have to create space for people to talk and dialogue and get it all out there. It means we have to tell people when we messed up and take ownership of that and take responsibility and commit to doing better and then actually do better.
Right.
Because repeated breaches of trust, there's no way to come back from that.
Right.
Particularly if you've been told over and over again that this is the thing that is causing XYZ cultural problem. So, yeah, so that's what I have to say about trust, Erica.
Amazing. So, can you tell the listeners where they can find you to get more information about your organization?
Absolutely. So we are at www.truereloveution.com. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to chat with anybody about their journeys, and you can follow along to read our articles and blogs. And I feel really deeply committed to this work. And so if I have planted a seed within you that you're thinking about at 3 a.m., reach out and let's chat, because what we do is quite different from normal consultants. I don't even know what a normal consultant is anymore, but I like to think that what we're offering the world, even in our trust diagnostic tool, is really unique and different from what organizations are traditionally measuring. And I know Moodally does a lot of this stuff, and a great compliment to the work that we're doing. So please reach out and know that you're not alone on the journey.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This was incredibly informative.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Erica.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Moodally Matters. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate that effort, and we'll catch you in the next episode of Moodally Matters.